Yeah, Senator, you will ignore the cameras and myself and just talk to Natasha.
Sorry, but I'm ignoring you.
Polls are looking pretty good for you. We had our own poll early and often did one, and not surprisingly, you were leading. However, more than 60% of the people we polled said they found it distasteful that you've spent 31 years in Washington. Can a politician be in office too long?
I think it's really up to the voters to decide. For some politicians, 2 years is too long, and for others, 20 years isn't long enough. Voters have to make that decision. And it really is a decision where you try to weigh two different things. How long has he been there, and is his tenure there of any value to us in terms of his judgment, in terms of his capacity to help our state and our families? Of course, I believe that my time in the House and the Senate, where I am today, has helped our state, helped the city of Chicago. I think that my position in the Senate gives us access to a lot of opportunities that we wouldn't have otherwise.
Looking back on your tenure in Washington, what would you hold up as your signature accomplishment?
Well, there are many things I've worked on over the years. I really believe that I focused earlier than most on the issue of tobacco and public health. The fact that for over 25 years, when you get on an airplane, smoking is prohibited was a law that I passed in the House of Representatives years ago. I feel strongly about this. I've worked with the American Lung Association, the American Heart Association, American Cancer Society, and I didn't stop with that. We have really basically eliminated tobacco subsidies. We've reduced them dramatically at the federal level. We've also policed retailers so that they would discourage them and stop them from selling to kids. That's one thing that I think made a big difference.
And that's something that's been associated with you for years, but that was a long time ago, and that was when you were in the House. What about in the Senate? Do you think you've had success? You've been in the majority.
I'll tell you a couple things I've done. If you ask most retailers in this state and around this country about the swipe fee, consumers don't know much about it. Every one of the retailers will. That's the amount the retailer pays to the debit card company every time you charge dinner or buy something at their retail establishment. And for years they had no voice in this. It was just imposed on them. You're going to pay it or else. If you want to use Visa cards and MasterCards, you got to collect this. We changed that law and we protected these retailers, and they'll tell you it made a big difference. I think it did. I've done a lot of work in immigration, and I have to point to that as something important to me and to this country. I introduced the DREAM Act. It was 13 years ago. It was my bill. And it came about because of a case in Chicago here involving a Korean girl who was going to be deported. And it still has yet to cross the finish line as final law. But more and more, both political parties are embracing it as the fair thing to do. You can't penalize kids for the wrongdoing of their parents. You've got to give these kids a chance.
The president has decided to stall that for now. Was that a right decision for him to make?
I think it was. It was so highly politically charged. It's hard to believe, but the House of Representatives, before they left for the August recess, with an overwhelming Republican vote, a few Democrats, but overwhelmingly Republican vote, said basically they wanted to deport 2 million kids who would be eligible for the DREAM Act. And then they stood up and gave themselves a standing ovation. It really was a sad moment. It's an indication of the depths which some had reached in this immigration debate. It wasn't that long ago that 8 of us, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, wrote a comprehensive immigration bill in the Senate and passed it with bipartisan roll call, one that we agreed on, a compromise bill. They won't even consider it in the House of Representatives. That's how political it's become.
They want increased border control. You say that there's more now than ever.
More than ever.
So how do you bring consensus
well,
on this issue?
Well, what we did was, there's now more than ever. The new immigration comprehensive bill dramatically increases that. There was an amendment on the floor, Senators Corker and Hoeven, 2 Republicans, and we accepted it. And we now can literally put a person every half mile on the border 24/7, 365 days a year, and all the technology that goes with it. I think we've overdone it, but we tried to meet the criticism that we weren't tough on the border. We did everything and then doubled it. So this argument, well, we can't really talk about all the rest of the broken immigration system until we talk about the border. We've done it, and the House wouldn't even consider it.
You're looking at the real possibility that you could be in the minority. Do you think that's a real possibility?
Well, it's always a possibility, but I think in the last 2 weeks we've been heartened because the polls are turning in our favor. We've gone from what was a debate on national issues in many states, a debate about Affordable Care Act, a debate about the president, and now it's come down to the candidates. And we have strong candidates, incumbent Democrat senators and challengers. And as a consequence, we're up in the polls. This last week was a lot better than the week before. But it's an indication. We have 6 or 7 weeks to go, and things could get better or worse. It's going to be close. I think we'll retain our majority.
Let's talk about your opponent. You had some very sharp differences when it came to the Walgreens situation. He says that you were using the power and the strength of the federal government to intimidate Walgreens financially. What is your take on that situation?
I got a nice letter from the village of Deerfield thanking me when it came to Walgreens for keeping that business in Deerfield. I think that's a senator's responsibility to work to keep businesses in this state and to keep them in this country, and that's what I set out to do. What Walgreens came to learn was that a consumer company ought to think twice about renouncing their American citizenship. Their customers were getting ready to walk, and I think they came to realize that. As I went around the city, around the state, people would come up to me and volunteer. I'll never set foot in one of their pharmacies again if they pick up and leave. At every level, working people all the way up to people well-to-do. So there was a strong consumer sentiment. Now here comes my opponent, and he's saying, oh, you shouldn't do this. There's a reason why he's saying that. Jim Oberweis is a walking inversion. He had an interview in the Sun-Times with Lynn Sweet last November. And it was an interview about what was going on with his residents in Florida. Right. Well, I know what was going on, and he does too. You see, in 2010, Jim Oberweis, for the first time in 10 years, stopped declaring his home in Kane County as his permanent residence. Why would he stop doing that? Because he'd bought a condo, a penthouse condo in Bonita Springs, Florida. And in order to get what he calls tax advantages in Florida, he couldn't claim Illinois as his permanent residency for tax purposes. Now he gets the benefits of a permanent residency in Florida. So what are those benefits? Tax advantages, for example, there's no income tax, no state income tax in Florida. That's an example he used. Jim Oberweis has refused to disclose his Illinois state income tax returns. And the obvious question is, out of the $1 million plus salary last year, how much did he pay Illinois income tax on? I think it's a question you ought to answer. I disclose all my income tax returns.
Your schedules included.
Schedules included, which is an important part of it. And I've done that every year I've been in public life. It discloses my income, the income of my wife, all of my dependent kids when they were living at home. And I think that's what public servants should do.
So at the state fair, Jim Oberweis got on that stage and he started saying, you know, tell millionaire Dick Durbin to go home. And, you know, do you think that's ironic that he's...
It is ironic because what he's done is to compare my wife and my life savings, which when you add in all the things we've been able to save, come to slightly over $1 million. And I'm not saying that we're poor by any measure. We're just fine, and I have no complaints there. He wants to compare that to the fact that his entire income last year was greater than my net worth. The amount he's put into this campaign so far is right there near what we've saved for the entirety of our lives. We're not wealthy, but we're not complaining. You know, we are lucky to have saved a lot of money over the years, raised our kids and helped pay for their education. But to compare my situation in life with Oberweis of Oberweis Dairy, that's an exaggeration.
To people who say that you went to Washington, you weren't a millionaire, and you are now, you're saying that's just from savings?
Exactly.
And not
that's
from
exactly
any benefit from being in Washington all these years?
Everything disclosed. I worked for Paul Simon, and he said the minute I came on his staff in 1969, we're going to make a full income disclosure, every employee on my staff, and all of our income tax returns every year. People may question our judgment on issues, but they'll never think that we're in this for the money. And I've done it every year. And some years it's painful, you know. When I first got out of law school, it was all student loans. I mean, I was technically bankrupt. It was all student loans. But we've done it every year, and I believe in that. And I think when you do that, and people come back and say, well, just how did you do that? How did you end up with these savings? I can point to it year by year. And what we did was save our income and put it away and invest it in retirement accounts, as most Americans do.
And your wife is a lobbyist?
She is. Not anymore. I mean, she's coming to an end. I think that she's not lobbying anymore, but officially it's for this calendar year. It runs out.
So she lobbies in Washington or Springfield?
Only Springfield.
Only Springfield.
And went to the Senate Ethics Committee and said, first, is it permissible and legal for the spouse of a member of the Senate to be a lobbyist? They said it is. Either a federal lobbyist or a state lobbyist. We said, we're not going to do any federal lobbying. to minimize and avoid conflicts. So all of our lobbying was in Springfield at the state level. And we were careful as we went through this. There were occasional overlaps. She represented the Illinois Lung Association. Well, as I mentioned earlier, one of their big issues is tobacco. So many times what she was setting out to do, I was supporting, but that was the case before she was a lobbyist. But in terms of ever choosing her clients, in terms of ever trying to influence anyone for her clients, never happened. We were very careful.
Do you think it's a benefit to her, though, to have, you know,
let's be honest,
her husband's one of the most powerful men in the country?
I don't know about all that, but I will tell you, perhaps it opened a door. There have been several legitimate investigations by journalists into my wife and what she's done, and they've come back and said, we can't find anything. And she's careful. She's an honest person, and she doesn't want to abuse any privilege that might come by virtue of our family name. And she's represented a lot of good clients. She represented a downstate university for a number of years. She's represented some social service agencies and the like. A big spectrum of clients, but she's been careful, and I'm very proud of her. I'm proud of what she's been able to accomplish.
At the Democratic National Convention, I remember you at one point kind of flirting with the idea that, I don't know if I'm going to run for another term or not. You seem to have some concern about your family, your age. You know, this is an 8-year commitment from that point. You know, are you committed to, if you are reelected, staying for the full 6 years? I
am committed to it. I don't see any alternative that I would consider, but I've got to win first. So before I presume what's going to happen for the next 6 years, the voters get to make that decision. And of course it's a tough decision. After you've served for a while and reached this point where we have 2 of the cutest grandkids on earth, you start thinking about, is this where you want to be? And I left it up more to my wife than anybody. Is it okay? What do you think? And she said yes. There have been moments in the campaign where she might have had second thoughts because it's a pretty rough road. But I think we believe that what I'm doing is important, and I hope that I can continue to.
Do you feel any vulnerabilities? And I saw a previous interview this week where you talked about every day you wake up in the morning and you think.
Eric Cantor. Open my eyes and say Eric Cantor and jump out of bed. And he was a reminder, you never should take any elections for granted, and I feel that way. I've never been outworked. I've been outspent, but never outworked by an opponent. I will match my schedule. I've watched my opponent's schedule. He does some things, but we are on the go constantly. It's a big state, and a lot of people, and a lot of things to do. And you know, my feeling on this is I owe it to the voters. At some point, they've got to make a decision. I want them to know who I am, and that's why I've agreed to debates. If you remember in the primary, Mr. Oberweis was facing a fellow named Doug Truax. And Truax said, I want a whole lot of debates since I'm not as well known. And Mr. Oberweis agreed to one debate. It was at the Sun City Senior Citizens Center in Huntley, Illinois, with no television coverage. One debate. So at this point, we're doing joint appearance at another newspaper, as we say in the business. And then we're going to have 2 televised debates. One of them through Channel 7, and the second one through all the public television stations in the state.
What do you think of the governor's race?
Interesting race, and it's going to be an interesting contest because we have 2 very wealthy candidates for senator and governor, Oberweis and Rauner. And as I've said before, I don't hold it against anybody that they're wealthy if they earned it honestly, and I believe both of them did. I have no reason not to believe that. And as I've said, you know, I'm only one Powerball ticket away from having the same amount of money they do. But here's the point I don't get. How can you be that well off and comfortable and say, I'm opposed to raising the minimum wage? And Mr. Oberweis has gone to an extreme. He now says, if you try to raise the minimum wage for anyone under the age of 26, it's against the law. What are you thinking, Jim? I mean, they may be ice cream dippers to you, but these are college students working their way through school. These are single moms raising kids. They're veterans coming back. And you're saying, nope, don't raise their minimum wage because they haven't reached the age of 26.
Do you think that has something to do with him not wanting to pay the people he's hiring?
Well, I know what he pays. He starts, most of them that are dipping the ice cream at Oberweis Dairies are starting with a training wage below the minimum wage for our state, and then they're graduated to the minimum wage. I've said to him, incidentally, we make disclosure of the salaries of all the people in our office, and I hope that he will make a similar disclosure of those who work for Oberweis Dairy. Let's find out from the top down how many women are working there and what people are paid. I've made a public disclosure of that. Let's see if he'll do the same.
They've tried to jump on that public disclosure and say that you don't have as many women. Can you clarify that?
There was a
situation?
blogger, listen to this, a blogger in Washington writes this, and it's just plain wrong. And so we sent the information to the Washington Times, which has its own political bent, and they ignore it. And so they start running radio ads against me on this. We contact the stations and say, here are the facts. This ad is just plain wrong. And they say, well, since he's produced a Washington Times article supporting his position, we're going to run the ad. We've got the facts, and we're disclosing these facts, and I hope that he will disclose them. I might add, he does two things. He has the dairy and Oberweis Securities. When you take a close look at Oberweis Securities, you really need a flashlight to find any women at the highest levels of management in his company.
You're calling on him to
Full disclosure.
Full disclosure, wages and
men and women
and
in the highest levels. Let's take the top 10 employees each place. How much they're paid, how many are men, how many are women. We've done that. And let's say how many men and how many women work for each of these entities and what's the comparable pay. I can tell you the answer. 6 out of the 10 top employees in my office are women. And when it comes to my staff, more women than men, and the women on average make more money than the men.
Would you directly tell him, like, hey, you should raise your own minimum wage in your stores?
Absolutely. I mean, he ought to know the reality of this, that many of the people who are working in these stores can't get by at $8.25 an hour. I believe that people who get up and go to work and are willing to, make that sacrifice, make that commitment, ought to have some respect. And respect means a decent wage.
What do you think about the African American support? He's had a couple of press conferences on different Sundays with different pastors coming up behind him. A couple of them have said, well, look, Democrats aren't doing anything for us.
I don't believe that any party is entitled to any vote. You earn it by the positions you take, by your values, and by your record. There have been 2 notable members of African American ministers who have come forward to endorse my opponent. There are thousands, at least hundreds in the city of Chicago. These 2 have come forward, and it's a novelty that an African American minister is going to endorse publicly a Republican candidate for the Senate. One of them said it's because of Oberweis's views on economic development. I would like a chance to speak to that minister and even his congregation about my viewpoint. I support increasing the minimum wage. Jim Oberweis opposes it. I support sensible gun control. Jim Oberweis is the preferred candidate of the National Rifle Association. He opposes most of the background checks that I support to keep guns out of the hands of felons and mentally unstable people. So when you're talking about violence in these neighborhoods, I've been there for a long time, for sensible gun control, respecting the rights of people under the Second Amendment to own guns legally, use them safely, store them safely, but also saying we have an obligation to keep guns out of the hands of people who misuse them. Mr. Oberweis is in a totally different place. I wonder if he's given that speech to these ministers as well as to their congregations.
Do you really think gun control is going to do anything for this area? I mean, most of the guns are in the hands of felons, of people who don't.
Can I tell you something? The #1 source of guns, one of the major sources of guns, Chuck's Gun Shop in Riverdale. And Chuck's, sadly, is selling guns through straw purchasers. People who can't buy the guns send in their girlfriends. I've got an amendment which says, a new law and a criminal code, which basically says, girlfriend, think twice. We're going to throw you away for a long time. If you're buying these guns, turn them over to that boyfriend who's a convicted felon. And that's what we've got to do. So can it make a difference? Let us slow down the traffic in firearms. That's got to help. It won't end the violence, but it's got to help. When I listen to Superintendent McCarthy say that the number of crime guns confiscated in Chicago last year was 6 times per capita those confiscated in the city of New York, you think to yourself, what's going on here? We are awash in guns.
But those are all illegally purchased, right?
All what?
Illegally?
I don't know.
Transferred?
I don't know. Going into Chuck's gun shop and having a girlfriend purchase the gun, they can argue, well, the girlfriend qualifies. We know what's going to happen to the gun when it goes out the door.
Can we go back to the minimum wage for a moment? I mean, a lot of people, I realize that Democrats are doing this across the nation, and it's a huge issue in the governor's race as well. Obama's been talking about it. But is this really going to lift people up?
For most of us, the idea of $1 an hour, $40 a week, $2 an hour, $80 a week would be nice. but it's not a difference, major difference in lifestyle. But if you're living at $8.25 an hour, $1 or $2 an hour can make a big difference in your life. A fellow named Robert Lee, I've been at a press conference with him, African American with a family of 5. He's making $8.25 an hour, scrambling to take every job he can, and he just flat out looked into the camera and said $2 an hour would make all the difference in the world. I think all of us, including Mr. Oberweis and Mr. Rauner, owe it to ourselves to try to understand what these folks are up against. They're trying to get by, raise a family, the basics in life, and they are just one illness or one bad occurrence away from the bottom falling out. So the notion of giving them an increase in minimum wage, yes, it doesn't sound like much to many of us, but to them, I think it means an awful lot.
Well, sure, but I mean, isn't there more of an economic engine that's needed there? Isn't there more job training and that sort of thing?
You put your finger on it. I've been visiting job training programs. I've found some that I think are excellent, that are really training people for real work with real pay, and we have to encourage those. At the same time, you probably know I've been harsh when it comes to these for-profit colleges and universities. When I came into your building here, on the first floor is a for-profit college that has been here for a long time, which can afford a beautiful setting in this great building downtown. Why? Because they charge an arm and a leg for tuition, and students don't know that that particular entity downstairs is not likely to produce a diploma, education, or a training that leads to a good job. This for-profit school industry ought to be looked at. They are bringing these children in, young people, and their parents, deep in debt with worthless diplomas. That, to me, is a travesty.
And what can you do about it?
We need to do more in Washington. I mean, the fact that we offer Pell Grants and federal loans through these for-profit colleges and universities. Think about this for a second. If I told you there was one automobile manufacturer responsible for cars that caused 46% of the fatal accidents on highways, you would say, Senator, close them down. Almost half of the fatal accidents? Right now, the for-profit colleges and universities have 10% of the students out of high school. They're responsible for 46% of student loan defaults. Why? The kids get deeply in debt over their heads. They drop out or end up with a worthless diploma and no job. And we've got to change it. I've got a lot of legislation in that would address this issue. I really think we've got to come to grips with this. You
said that there's hundreds of ministers, on the South Side. Do you have a good relationship?
I do. And I've been visiting with them, a lot of old friends, and a lot of folks that I'm coming to know during the course of the campaign. I had a meeting this last Monday. 30 or 40 of these ministers, without my solicitation, came forward and endorsed me. I will tell you this, if Mr. Oberweis wants this battle fought among African Americans in Chicago or in Cook County, be my guest. I think my voting record, my support of the president, and my support of programs that can make a positive difference in their lives, I'll do quite well.
The IRS.
Oh, I'm glad you brought it up.
So the letter you sent involving Crossroads, why did you send that letter?
I sent that letter because Crossroads and many other entities on both sides, Democrat and Republican, were claiming tax-exempt status. They were trying to be political organizations, raising money and spending money on a tax-exempt basis. The law was pretty clear. You could not do that if your involvement and your activity was primarily political. What do you think Karl Rove's up to? It's not only primarily, it's exclusively political. And so I raised a question. Why did I pick on Crossroads? It was one of the first and clearly one of the biggest. But I went on in the letter and said, let's investigate them all. I don't want anybody taking advantage of this for secret contributions to campaigns. And then Mr. Oberweis is kind of arguing I was a real secret. I disclosed the letter, made it public. There was no question about it. I joined a lot of others asking the IRS the same question. Well, what do we know today? We know the IRS was going after groups that had Tea Party and conservative in their name, but they were also going after groups that had progressive and Democrat in their name. And they shouldn't have done that. They should have gone after the category of 501c3s and asked the basic questions of all of them. That was a point of my letter. And I'll tell you this, if you picked out 100 people in Illinois and said, how much do you think this campaign should focus on an investigation 4 years ago of Karl Rove by the IRS? Couldn't find 2. This is a dog whistle for the Tea Party Republicans. And Mr. Oberweis is running these ads to fire up his Tea Party base. and he can be my guest. I know what the important issues are as I travel around this state. The creation of good paying jobs, making sure that working families have the resources they need to get by and put their kids through college. These are the things people care about. It isn't whether Karl Rove's being picked on.
Do you expect that Obama will come in and campaign for you here?
I'd love to have him come in. I've invited him. But I've told him, quite honestly, as much as I'd like to have him, I want Michelle more. She is very popular, and she could be an important factor in bringing out the vote.
Do you think there's any way in a million years she'll run for U.S. Senate?
No. I don't. There's always speculation.
Yeah.
And after Hillary Clinton ran, of course they would ask the question. I don't see it.
Well, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.